Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our live stream audience and also the audiences that listen to this later, either on our podcast or on our YouTube channel. This is one of over 600 programs we've done since the pandemic began. We'll be opening up to live audiences fairly soon in San Francisco. But so far, we've been trying to bring you exactly what we've done for over 100 years in San Francisco, which is to discuss large topics in politics, public affairs, but also any author that's bringing out a lot of interesting ideas. We love to have that as part of our whole platform of what we like to present to you so that you can enjoy the intellectual stimulation that comes from new ideas. So today we have Nina Kraus. Her book is quite appropriately titled Of Sound Mind. And she's going to give us an idea about what it's like. I mean, our minds are obviously visually oriented, but we have five senses, and we learn a lot from all the input. And we're going to talk about the science behind it and also the psychology behind it. Well, thank you very much, Nina, for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
So why don't we start with Helen Keller's observation? I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, she said that sight connects us with things, and sound connects us with others, with other living things. Mm-hmm. And there have been experiments where people have taken polls of what is the favorite sense. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that most people would much prefer to lose any sense other than their visual sense. But I think that is because hearing is under-recognized. Mm-hmm. And, I'm really glad that you started with this, George, because a core feature of sound is that it connects us. Mm-hmm. Sound is alive, and right now, you and I are talking, and we have this, what Ian McGilchrist calls betweenness. This very alive activity, which is, it's improvised. It's in the moment. We're everyday improvisers. We don't have a script. Mm-hmm. And yet you and I, we're connecting, and sound connects all of us humans, and it connects other living things with other living things and the whole network of life.
It's interesting. I just came back from my 50th high school reunion. And I think for those who attend any reunions, haven't seen people for a long time, I think the easiest way to recognize people is to close your eyes and listen to their voice. That actually, you can recognize them much more easily than you can if you just see their faces. Obviously, the face helps, and if you have any kind of memory of being able to progress people, etc. But it's very funny. And the visual cues, again, are very interesting because a lot of people think that all their classmates look younger than they actually are. And the reason for it, I think, is because their visual cues are coming from the eyes and from the mouth. And these are the children that they grew up with, and they see them as children. Whereas somebody who didn't know them, then they just look at them and say, that's a body that has aged appropriately for 68 years of age, that kind of thing. So I find that the oral cues there, and it's a good, lead into your thing, are more clearly indicative of who you're talking to, who you're dealing with. Have you found any of that in your research? That people can recognize voices faster?
Yeah, I mean, our sound mind makes us, first of all. But you talk about the sound of the voice. There's this expression that, oh, it's so good to hear the sound of your voice. Well, it is really good to hear the sound of your voice because there's so much information there about you, about who you are, about your memory, and just your memories with that person. And I think that gets to the idea that I really discuss a lot in the book, which is that the sound mind is vast. And really, if we step back for a minute, we think, my point is that the hearing brain is vast. I think classically, when people think of hearing, first of all, they think that a lot of hearing happens in our ear, but a lot of it most of it happens in our brain. I mean, think of Beethoven.
Right.
Right. Sound engages the hearing brain, engages not just the classic auditory pathway, also from ear to brain and back again, but it engages how we think. So our cognitive skills, and that includes our memory. So it engages how we think, how we feel. And also there, you can see the intertwinedness, how our memories make us feel, right? So it engages how we think, how we feel, how we move. I mean, sound is movement. It's the movement of air molecules. And one of the exciting things about sound is that it's dynamic. And I think, again, one of the reasons that people don't notice it as much is because sound is produced and then it's gone. You don't have this thing that you can hold on to. But so the hearing brain engages how we think, how we feel, how we move, and how we integrate the information from the other senses. So our visual sense and what we smell, and our touch, all of our senses are deeply ingrained with how we hear, so that the hearing brain, the sound mind, is vast and much vaster than most of us are aware of.
I want to go into the science of how we turn all of those. We feel that we're touching reality. We're never really touching reality or hearing, or we're getting signals that our brain process turns into electricity and then is analyzed. But before we go into that, let's talk about something that's very up to date, which is Tony Bennett, because Tony Bennett was just on 60 Minutes, and he has Alzheimer's, but he can't carry on a conversation very easily, but he can get up and sing songs that he knows and believe. And now this has been around for a while. People have known this, I dealt with my own father 20 years ago about the same issue, but it being Tony Bennett, and to see this on TV where everybody can see and hear him switch from one way of thinking to another based upon his sound memory, I thought was sort of perfect timing for your program.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit? Did you see the program?
I did see the program, and it's really touching, and it speaks to something that we really know quite well, but again, don't realize and don't appreciate. Music should be part of mainstream medicine, certainly for memory disorders, because again, sound has a very, very direct link to our memory, because we have to learn through sound. If you think from an evolutionary perspective, organisms throughout history have had to make sense of sound and to disambiguate. I hear the grass is moving, but there is a slight change in that movement of the grass that now signals a potential mate or predator. Is this lunch, or what, but
or am I lunch,
right. And you have to learn this, and this is deeply learned. And again, what I love to think about the sound mind, and really what is at the core of the book is how the things that we do again and again, like Tony Bennett, are what make us us. And I think, again, we are so primed to think about what's happening in the moment, but really what makes us us is the experiences that we've had throughout our lives, how we have spent our time, which is why I think that we have a huge responsibility to ourselves and our children and our educational system and our medical system to really think about what is the best way to be spending time. And a lot of the best ways, in my view, means engaging with sound.
This is towards the end of your book, but we'll go there right now. But you mentioned about music as medicine, and you do mention in your book also that Pythagoras used it exactly like that. He's known for his mathematics, but part of what he did in music was he realized that there was a mathematical basis for the scale. And is therefore responsible basically for the scales that we use in Western music. And he used music as therapy for people, as you mentioned. Yeah. So it goes back that far. But your research and other people's research in this area is showing that there's a real reason for this. Now, you mentioned a lot of things that you would suggest as part of the fact that we have a sound mind, for there to be a bigger emphasis on in education. And it was fascinating how much better musicians, for example, did on different tests. So I think you mentioned bilingualism, music, and athletes. That was an interesting one. If you think how much information they have to take in perfectly in order to catch the ball when they're looking in the other direction, turn around, catch the ball, and all that kind of stuff. They're getting cues from all over the place, and they are tightly attuned to that. So why don't you talk about those parts of what you think should be more educational, without getting concussions, of course. And also like the specialties. Your husband sounds like he's particularly sonically gifted, I have to say.
Well, yeah, he's a musician, and he is just it's just wonderful to be living with that sound mind. I'm so lucky to be able to hear the music that he makes all the time. And actually during the pandemic, one of the things he does is he teaches, and he's been teaching 40 lessons through Zoom. And so from time to time, we might even be hearing some notes wafting in and out of our sonic space, and it's wonderful. This is the kind of sound that I'm very happy to have in my sonic world. Yeah. But let me talk about musicians and athletes and bilinguals. And also, I don't want to mention to you, because I know you are a deep thinker and a philosopher. People have thought about the binding problem. Right. And how is it that we are able to combine information from so many different aspects of our lives? And I think we can really see this in the sound mind. And also biologically, a lot of the action is actually happening in the midbrain, which is in the center of the action. And it's getting information from every possible area of the brain and nervous system. And this is part of the biological reason that sound is such an important way of binding information, and the sound mind is. If I step back just for a minute and talk about sound ingredients, and the fact that there are ingredients in sound like pitch and timing and timbre that people don't usually think about. They like for visual object, this thing has a color, a shape, a size, a certain feel to it. And so people are very aware of visual ingredients, but sound ingredients are are as many, but they're invisible, so we don't notice them as much. And it turns out that a bilingual, a musician, and an athlete strengthen different parts of the sonic information. The metaphor that I like to use, and I use in the book, and I hope you enjoy the illustrations. I work with an artist, Katie Shelley, in partnership with her. So there are 80 pictures in the book, and 40 of them she made, and we kind of went back and forth with each one. The mixing board is the idea that we have all of these ingredients, and then our sound mind will increase or reduce the faders on the mixing board of the different ingredients based on our life in sound. Is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's fine. I just have to make a little adjustment, but you go right ahead.
Okay. And so, you can think about this mixing board with faders, and with different faders being enhanced or reduced, very much dependent on our history and our life in sound, how we have spent our life making sense of sound. And so bilinguals need to be, they have these 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, how many languages you speak, systems in the brain that are always there. And you need to be kind of switching from one to the other, so you get a very flexible mind. But it turns out that one of the ingredients that is really enhanced in the bilingual brain is the fundamental frequency in sound. And that is very important for pitch. Like your voice is at a lower fundamental frequency than mine, and a child's voice will be at a higher fundamental. And so, you can imagine that the voice is very much something that defines me or you as an auditory object.
Yeah.
Right? That's what
Absolutely.
What the scientists call it. But bilinguals are especially good at processing, and we can see this objectively. We were able to put sensors on your scalp and actually measure the electricity that sound produces in anyone. And if you are a bilingual, the fundamental frequency, that fader, is going to be turned way up. If you're a musician, the faders for the harmonics, which are important, of course, for distinguishing a flute and a violin playing the same note. It's the harmonics that tell you that. But the harmonics also enable us to distinguish a B from a D and a P. And so, this is hugely important for language. And I can tell you that the faders that are enhanced in musicians are exactly the same ones, or there's tremendous overlap between the musician brain and what you need for various language skills. Because the harmonics, for example, are so important for reading, making the kinds of sound to meaning connections that you have to make in order to read. So it's harmonics and timing. Timing on multiple time scales, from microseconds to seconds and over time, and rhythm, and there's rhythm in language. So these are the faders for rhythm and timing and harmonics are enhanced in the musician. And then you have the athlete brain, who so we're involved in an NIH funded study that is looking at all of our Northwestern elite Division I athletes, all 500 of them, and we're following them over 5 years. And so, we wondered, would there be something special about the sound mind in the elite athlete? And what we discovered is that there was no difference in the processing of the sound ingredients that we looked at compared to a typical person who was not an athlete. So we didn't see the kind of enhancement that we saw in, say, bilinguals or in musicians. But what we saw is that the elite athlete had a very quiet brain. Because our nervous system, our brain is always on there, and you can think of a lot of the electricity happening because the currency of the nervous system, of course, is electricity, and there's a lot of static that is going on, and that background static is reduced in the elite athlete. Consequently, the bilingual, the musician, and the elite athlete all have enhanced sound processing, but they do it for biologically different reasons. The bilingual and the musician enhance certain sound ingredients, and the athlete enhances them all because there is less biological noise.
I thought that was just fascinating. And I wondered, because a lot of athletes actually have a lower metabolism. I mean, their heart rate is usually lower at rest. And I was wondering if that was also part of their quietness, part of their internal noise. But it's a fascinating, and no one would have predicted that conclusion.
That's why science is so fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's nice. Yeah, it's nice that when you go into science and trying to study something, you're expecting one answer and you get a totally different one that's illuminating. Let's talk about pitch for a second. There was a lot of information to unpack in your summary there. One of the things I found interesting was that Mandarin has, it has all these tones. And so people who speak Mandarin have an enhanced soundscape that most other people don't have, because they don't have that tonal perception. And lots of people, of course, make fun of how it sounds if they're not used to it. But it's extremely clever way to enhance the amount of information that you can convey with a smaller number of words. I lived in Hong Kong for 1.5 years, many, many years ago. And there was always talk about that, about all the different tones and how impossible it is to learn a language that's based on that. But as you said, anything can actually be learned if you put your mind to it about learning these sounds. That's another thing I thought was fascinating, that you can learn to pay attention to things that you've never paid attention to from a sonic point of view.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And what is wonderful, and again, such a testament to we are what we do. Babies are born with the potential to learn all of the world's languages, but depending on the language that has a sound to meaning connection for that baby, the potential for all the other languages is there, but gets diminished over time. And what is strengthened is the sonic mind, the sound ingredients that are important for the language that you speak. And certainly if you speak a tone language, there are these dips and rises and movements of pitch within a syllable. I mean, obviously in a language like English, we have all kinds of changes in pitch, like if I'm just asking a question or a statement. But that's happening over a much longer time frame than a syllable, like ma, will have. It can be spoken with a different pitch trajectory and have a different meaning.
Yeah, it was fascinating that you mentioned in the research, because I had not read research like that before on language, but I had come across the idea that learning a language before you reach puberty is useful, because you learn to make the sounds. And therefore your larynx is developed in the muscles in a certain way. And once you get through puberty, where our larynxes are all affected by going through puberty, it's harder to shift the muscles of the larynx in a way that can make those particular sounds in other languages that you've never run into before harder to make, which it makes learning other languages harder after puberty. Now you're adding a totally new thing, or not totally new, but I mean, to me, it's new. Idea that you learn these sounds in your mind as a child, as a very young child. And if it's outside that range, that also makes it harder to put it into your soundscape later on in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important really at any age, but, because the sound of speaking, when we're speaking, we're hearing ourselves. And so that coordination also between the mouth and the vocal apparatus and what we hear. I mean, again, I think there is just a much more holistic view of the senses that I'm fascinated by. And it's really different from it's quite at odds from, if you're a scientist like me, you see that there are different meetings for the vision people and the hearing people and the emotion people and the voice people, and even there are different institutes of health for different body functions, and yet there is so much more integration than I think we're really quite generally aware of, and that's really just something that I am increasingly fascinated by, and fascinated also by the fact that just even in terms of a continuum of living things, there's this idea philosophically of them and us. And that the plants and animals are kind of these lesser beings, and us, we're sort of the supreme Homo sapiens, and in fact, from a biological standpoint, there's this tremendous continuity, and plants and animals, trees, we all use sound, we all actually communicate, often on slower or faster time scales and visual scales, but the underlying biological principles, so here I'm speaking as a biologist, are tremendously common. And these other living things have capacities that way outstrip what humans can do.
For all the plants that are listening, I think you should should talk about the experiment where the sound of water was played under the roots of a plant at the right hertz, and that made the plant grow its roots in the direction of the water. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So this is Monica Galliano's work, and any plumber will tell you that the roots of trees are going to get into the pipes underground. So we've observed this for a long time, and it turns out that some of the cues that the roots are responding to are sound, and it's there's a particular tuning at around 100 or 200 hertz. That's a frequency cycles per second. It's actually kind of at about the frequency of a male voice, the fundamental frequency. But the plants, the roots, are tuned to go and to grow towards the direction of the sound. And so what Dr. Galliano did is she had plants that were grown in a pot that could go in, the roots could go in various conditions, in various directions rather. And on one side she would have sound, and on the other side there would be no sound, and otherwise the environment was identical, and the roots would go towards the sound and not as much towards the direction where there was no sound. So clearly plants respond to sound and to vibration more than even for example, we're talking about the birds and the bees. So the plants will release their pollen just to a bee that is buzzing at a particular frequency. So it's not, there are going to be other insects flying around, but this organism, this biological organism, this plant, is able to detect it. Through years of evolution, it has learned that this particular bee is going to be really good for pollinating its species. So it's I'm constantly surprised and amazed by how vast not only our hearing brain is, our sound mind, but our sonic world.
Well, we look out at the world and we see, as you mentioned before, we look at it visually so much and we just think of physical objects and stuff like that. But we're really taking in three of our senses, touch and hearing and seeing, are all based on different vibratory abilities that are reaching us. And the world looks completely different if you're not looking at the objects, but you're just looking at all the photons, all the radiation, or all the motion, all the waves that are going on. And it's clear to everybody that plants are taking cues from the sunshine. That's been clear for thousands and thousands of years. Everyone knows the plants follow the sun in order to maximize their exposure to the sun rays. And that's also a reaction to vibration or
waves.
to waves. Yeah. So we like just a big picture thing about our senses. So we have these three senses. The other two, sense of smell and sense of sense of smell and sense of taste, are based upon chemicals, upon molecules that come in and they're turned into electrical signals that are sent to our brain. The other three are all different kinds of vibrational experiences that are then transformed by our nerves into our nerves for electrical signals to our brain and somehow sorted out. That's a very vague way of saying it. Do you want to put in some of the details?
Well, I mean, I wish I had more answers. We want to know, and my students are always asking me for the answer. And first of all,
it's not religion class.
I think that's right. I think that we, there's so much that we don't know, and
Right.
I think that it's really important for scientists to appreciate that. And it's also important. I mean, again, with my students, when they ask for the answer is almost always it depends, because context is going to matter. But you asked, also what is going on in the brain, and one of the chapters in my book is called The Quest. And so for decades, my group, we call ourselves Brain Volts, and I hope that people will go to our website, which is a labor of love. But we have tried to figure out how to measure sound processing in the brain in a way, in a way that captures this holistic nature of sound processing. And we have been able to do this with a particular response called the frequency following response, which gathers information from the whole sound mind or hearing brain. It gathers information from our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward networks, from our senses, from our ears and eyes, and our experience, how we feel about the sounds. And this is sculpted over time. And again, we can, as biologists, we can measure individual neuron responses and see how they change with experience. But a lot of this brain response that we measure, this frequency following response, I like to think of it as a snapshot of sound processing and a snapshot of the sound mind. And a lot of the information is being processed in the midbrain, which is a great title for something that's in the middle of the action. It's not, everybody wants to know where something is happening. It's not happening in the midbrain. The midbrain is just an important generating source for the sonic information that we can, that is then revealed on the scalp. But importantly, because it's in the middle of the action, it reflects information from many, many, many parts of the brain. So I think that we really are beginning to understand biologically what some of the mechanisms are, and we talk about afferent and efferent pathways. So they're afferent pathways that take information from our ear to our brain, or really from any organ. Afferent, to the heart. Efferent or efferent is away from.
Mm-hmm.
But you can think of the ear to brain pathway, and that has been the classical auditory pathway that's been studied for years. Turns out the efferent or efferent pathway is taking information from various parts of the brain and feeding it back to within the brain all the way out to the ear.
Mm-hmm.
So, the ear is hearing the brain. And we know from an evolutionary standpoint that the efferent system is more massive than the pathways going upstairs. And also with increased evolutionary development, the more complex an organism is, and the more able that organism is to learn and to be modified by experience, the greater. So the efferent system is really the special sauce that makes learning possible. And so again, we are learning about how this feedback from the efferent system, which we can measure with neurons actually within the brain in experimental animals, and we can see how information from the efferent system then modifies information in the afferent system. So, so that our default processing, if somebody says knee, as in Nina, I was in a boxing class, and every time they said knee, it was, you learn, certain things are just, are just default, are inherent, are automatic because you've learned. So I'm saying, by example, that my afferent system now responds to knee in a very efficient way because of all of the efferent processing that has led up to that all throughout my life, all of that experience.
It's you just mentioned it, and at the risk of giving away the not so secret information that we're all narcissists, there's this party effect. You're at a big party and there's like 10 different groups of people chatting, and you're listening to the conversation of the group that you're in. But if someone mentions your name 3 groups over, you hear it. Maybe not every single time, but often. And it's interesting because it must mean that all the sounds of all the conversations are making their way, in a certain way or another, into your ears and into your brain, and being ignored as unimportant. And so as you call it, pruning, the pruning of the sounds must be the most amount of work that's being done, because there's a tremendous more amount of sound coming into your head than you pay attention to.
That's right.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because it's fascinating. Almost everybody has had that experience of suddenly hearing something from far away because it's your name.
Yeah, and actually you can hear something else, which is that you're not aware of, which is silence. I think we've all had the experience of, the truck outside that's been idling and making a lot of noise. It turns off, cuts the ignition. And suddenly, you hadn't noticed that truck was there. It was there all the time. And suddenly the sound comes off and you react. You go,
yeah.
And so there is so much sound, and the absence of it, the presence and absence of sound, is something that we are very attuned to, and very specifically attuned to in terms of what we learn to pay attention to. You mentioned my husband, who's a musician. I play some music, and as I was learning a particular guitar lick, I was just wondering, how do I get my fingers to move so quickly? I thought it was something that I needed to do with my picking hand to get these notes to just fly out in rapid succession. My husband comes by and he says, Nina, if you would listen, you would hear the distinctive sound of a pull-off, which is actually you're using your left hand and pulling off the strings very rapidly. And that enables you to make different sounds very, very quickly in a way that is not possible with your picking hand. But it has a particular sound, but you have to learn to pay attention to it first. So I was deaf to that sound until my husband came around and pointed it out to me, and I listened, and I made these sound to meaning connections, and also tried to, through my body, tried to resolve the physical complexities of making those sounds and listening to them and getting that feedback. You can just see my afferent and efferent systems working. But now when I hear that, I know what it is. And I can do that. Oh yeah, I know what to do.
Because you have a line in your book. Attention is the holy grail. And from a philosophical point of view about the mind, it's really a kind of a very interesting statement that what you're paying attention to is crucial to what you do with all the information that you're bringing in. You're in a sea of information, but you pay attention to a very small part of it, and how you make those decisions is interesting. And one of my favorite examples is you're driving down the highway and you're listening to the radio, and one of your favorite songs is on, and you're singing along to the song and stuff like that. And then ahead of you, you see somebody driving crazily and almost causing an accident. You're paying attention to that. Do I have to stop? Do I have to pull over? What do I have to do about this situation? So you're paying attention to that for about, say, 15 seconds. It resolves. The crazy driver doesn't hit anybody, and so it calms down. And suddenly, as it calms down, you realize that the radio is still on, the music is still playing, and you did not hear that, even though it's your favorite song, for 15 seconds or so. It was totally blocked out of your awareness, even though you know that your ears are hearing it.
Yeah.
But your attention, whatever controls your attention, is saying that's not interesting right now.
Right, which is why how we direct our attention is so important, and such an important responsibility, again, for all of us. Do we want to be paying attention to plinging things? Do we want to be, paying attention to screens all the time? There are obvious advantages, as we can see right now. But, I think that how we spend our time, and consequently our attention, so changes us biologically. And I really go through that, for those who have the patience to read through the biology. I'm not just saying this. There are, and in fact, 20% of the book is references, for anybody who wants to get a little bit more information, but also just mostly to make the point that I'm not making this up. I'm not just saying, oh, this is how I think it is. This is how converging evidence from multiple studies and labs and thinkers think it works, and I'm putting it together in this way. And so I talk about attention a great deal, and what that does to us biologically. So, we understand some of these mechanisms, I think, quite well, and how at every part of the hearing brain, cortically, in the thalamus, in the brainstem, in the ear, there are, when you go in there with microelectrodes and you measure responses to sounds that are either paid attention to or not, or that have some meaning to the animal, you can really see how attention changes the response in the moment and changes the responses in the future in a way that then I think begs us to be mindful about where and how we direct our attention.
Yeah, and I think it'd be good to mention it, not important for our young adult listeners, but for those who are our age, if you'd stop paying attention to brain science and research back when you were a teenager or in college, there's been a big shift in ideas. Some of the ideas that were considered absolutely crucial, like left brain, right brain split, and the brain is hardwired for different things. Those ideas are pretty much long gone, and that the research has shown the brain is much more plastic in terms of how the different parts of it can be used, even though it is specialized. But if something goes wrong with some of the special areas, other areas can often take over, if not all, at least a portion of that. So
yeah, and when many things go right, changes are being made. So
yeah. So one thing that's useful is some of the ideas that you had for how to, for example, delay dementia in people has to do with music education. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? I mean, almost everybody is interested in keeping that as far away as possible.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, the science has shown that people who speak another language, I think because of the inherent cognitive flexibility that is involved in speaking that other language, that can delay the onset of dementia. I think one of the things that disconnects us from the world is our increased inability to hear people talking to us in noisy situations. And that can get increasingly, I mean, it's hard for anybody at any time in their lives, but as we get older, it becomes increasingly difficult. It turns out that auditory experts, for example, musicians, and when I talk about a musician, I'm talking about somebody who regularly plays music. I'm not talking about a professional musician at all. So, we've learned that musicians are simply better at picking out sounds and sentences and relevant information in background noise. And we see this across the lifespan, but we see this, say, in an older adult who has a typical older person hearing loss, so some presbycusis, some hearing loss on the higher frequencies. And if you match two older adults with a presbycusic hearing loss, and one has a life of regularly making music, and the other does not, the person who has been making music throughout their lives, or even just for parts of their lives, because there's a legacy,
right.
that the ability to hear speech in noise is improved. So, this is really important for, again, the connection between sound and our cognitive skills. Actually, if we lose our hearing, there have been studies showing that it diminishes one's ability to think, because you have to again, the hearing brain engages how we think, and if you are not hearing the sounds, then you are not engaging with other people, and you're not thinking as efficiently, because that connection, sound connects us. That connection with sound and the world is diminished.
Yeah, your thinking is just silent, talking. You somehow the sound is in your mind, and for those who are a little less emotionally restrained, the words come out of their mouth anyway. Whatever they're thinking, the words come out of their mouth, either when they're asleep or when they're walking down the street, that kind of situation. But it's interesting that we have these different ways of trying to understand what's going on in our thoughts, in our minds as we age. But there are ways, as you said, that you can get over. You can overcome the disabilities, the physical disabilities, with mental skills. So no one who's over 60 is going to become a major athlete or an elite athlete at that point. That doesn't work. But you can resurrect your bilingual skills. You can resurrect your music skills and practice them.
Or start them.
Or start them.
And again, we don't have to be thinking about perfection and about the elite athlete. Moving at any age, and it could be walking around the block a few times. If you're not doing that, there's actually plenty of research that will show that your thinking ability is better if you're physically active.
Yeah.
And the same goes for, even if you've never played a musical instrument, it's never too late to start. You probably are it just doesn't matter how, and that's another thing that we've shown biologically and others have shown, is that it really doesn't matter how good you are. What is much more important in terms of tuning the sound mind, and every sound mind will be tuned. If you're a beginning musician, you are going to be impacting your sound mind. And that's important.
Very important. So you've been at BrainVolts for how many years? 3 decades or so? Yeah. So what was the research outcome that surprised you the most, or it doesn't have to be the absolute most, but what comes to your mind saying, boy, I wasn't expecting that answer, sort of thing?
Yeah. Oh, so many times. But I mean, one of the things that made an impression on me was very early on, I was measuring single neuron responses while an animal learned a tone signaled task. So the animal learned that when a tone came on, a certain reward was going to happen or not. And it was really fascinating to see firsthand that you have this individual neuron. So you're measuring the electricity from this individual neuron. The sound is the same. The animal is the same. But once the animal has learned that the sound has meaning, the neuron will fire differently to that same sound. And that was just it just kind of hit me over the head of, look, this is clearly the brain changes. And the brain changes with experience. We can see this on an individual cell level. This must be happening 1 billion times over throughout our whole nervous system. So that made a huge impression on me. It also made an impression on me. Increasingly, we've been interested in rhythm, and the idea of people think about rhythm, you think about music, but there's so much rhythm in speech. Rhythm in speech is tremendously important, and again, the research has shown that many kids who have difficulty learning to read or with language skills have difficulties following a beat or with various rhythm skills. So we've been looking into rhythm skills and the what is happening to the brain's response to sound, and people who have this skill or that skill. And we had a whole suite of rhythm skills. And if you would have asked me at the beginning, if you're good at one task, are you likely to be good at another? And I would have answered, yeah, you're just good at rhythm. But it turns out that once again, I was wrong, and I'm wrong all the time. And I'm so comfortable with it, because, and so, I was just delighted to learn that you can't predict how good a job a person is going to do following just the beat to music and following a rhythmic pattern. Like if I say, and then you have to copy that.
Please don't ask me to do that.
that's a rhythmic pattern,
right?
And these are two very, very different skills. And people had known for some time that with brain tumors and lesions, that sometimes these skills could be dissociated. It turns out they're dissociated in all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that fascinates me is that I like to think about, how music is so important for learning both of these skills, because if you look at the time signature, that tells you something about the beat. It tells you where the one is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, it's 4/4 time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the note durations and rests, those are the rhythmic patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So if you learn those patterns and you're doing this simultaneously, at the same time you're keeping track of the beat, that's again another way of understanding why making music would help our language skills.
Well, it's pretty clear too, just from the past. If you just say, is it easier to memorize a paragraph or a poem or a song? So each one, the song has the most rhythm to it, and other musical beat cues and stuff like that. And a poem, especially if it's with a set rhythm and stuff like that, is not free verse, is just as useful in memorizing. And so if you go back a couple thousand years, people, of course, they just memorized long poems. They didn't memorize prose. Nobody could memorize 10,000 lines of prose, but 10,000 lines of poetry was done by lots of children that were learning in the schools where that was the emphasis. I mean, that doesn't.
History was brought down that way, right?
Right, exactly. The stories are brought down that way.
The bards.
Yeah. So, and today, if you just look at today, if you ask people, what have you memorized that you can tell me? A lot of people would say, I haven't memorized anything. And then you say, what are the words to your favorite song, or sing your favorite song? And almost all people would have some songs that even if they can't sing, they can kind of fake sing and do the words that go to it because of the emotional elements plus the rhythm that are involved in that process.
Yeah, but I think that more emphasis on memory and what our parents and parents had to do in school in terms of my mom was Italian, and she had to they of course learned a lot of Dante, and
Yes.
they had to as little school kids really recite parts of the Divine Comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that engages a lot of the sound mind, and we're losing some strength there by not doing activities like that. Now, if you want to know, what did Virgil say, you look it up.
Yeah, right.
Whereas
find it right away.
But there's really something to, and also I think just even in terms of our memory skills in general, I think that it's really, that idea of racking your brain for what was the name of that song?
Yeah.
Where did I see this? And, just to look it up is depriving your brain of exercise.
Well, when you mentioned the school children learning Dante, of course, that was also useful for other things, especially if they learn the verses of how, what's going to happen to you in hell if you don't behave yourself in class. That's all right. Well, we have a few questions from the audience that I thought, we could ask here. Mary Eisenson asks, how do we teach people to actively listen like this? What kind of processes do you have to do that?
Yeah. Well, I think engaging in activities like that engage, make you really focus and pay attention to sound with your whole being, like making music, learning another language, being a sound engineer, being a bird watcher, being aware of sounds in nature, and also respecting sound, honoring sound, so that you create for yourself and for your children and your society, if you will, a sonic environment that is not noisy, so that we aren't impeded in learning about sound because you just can't hear it because and I think people are very cavalier about the sounds and the noises that we put up with, and I think that we can just ask ourselves. I mean, many things are necessary, but other things are not. Is it necessary? You're at an airport, and planes are noisy, conveyor belts are noisy. Is it necessary to hear the boarding pass scanned the 223 times for every passenger? Beep, 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 beep. That's not, but people don't even realize that is contributing to their, you're in a constant state of alarm because sound is our alerting sense. So there's a lot that we can do.
And it's tough enough for the passengers going through, but the people who work there are all day long. It's got to invade their dreams. It's the same thing I feel about checkouts who work at the grocery store.
It's just unnecessary.
The sounds are all over the place. Yeah.
I think there should be fines for burglar alarms.
You mentioned, you mentioned briefly, it's probably more expensive to us to hear the alarm than to just let the theft take place. So you mentioned something about bird songs, and I have two things I wanted you to talk about from that. One is the owl story we were talking about a little bit earlier, and the other is the larynx-syrinx difference. I thought that was fascinating. So why don't you tell the story about the owl and then tell about how birds do things slightly differently, and that they evolutionarily are totally independent, the syrinx and the larynx, which I think is also interesting because it means sound is so much more valuable that independently this will happen in different places.
Yeah. Well, the owl story is just a great story for how the brain changes with experience, because owls are, they're nocturnal animals, and they really depend on sound for their survival. And so they have a very, very good auditory hearing brain. And this has been studied very, very carefully by neuroscientists who have measured sound processing in various parts of the owl brain. And long story short, the owl will respond to sounds that are occurring at particular parts in space because the owl has an auditory visual spatial map of sounds of their soundscape. And what you can do, and so we know, the first thing that the scientists did is that they learned that owls have this very detailed auditory visual map. And then you can put prisms on the animal's eyes that will shift their visual field, say 30 degrees to the right or to the left, or somehow change the visual field so that they're not getting the same cues and aligning the auditory and visual information. And so now when you go into the brain and you look at the individual neurons, you find that the maps in time will shift to this new input that the animal is getting. And again, the lesson to be learned here is that if you change the visual input or you change the auditory input, the brain will change. There are consequences. And also, so if a kid has an ear infection, or if again, this has been shown in a lot of experiments with ferrets, if you plug one ear, what happens to the mapping of sound along different parts of the hearing brain, and there are consequences. And then if you remove the plug, or if you remove the ear, the goggles, the animal will eventually learn to readjust. But I think that the point is that throughout our lives, our brain will change based on our experience. And and the other thing that we learned with the owl is, people ask, well, is it, am I too old to learn? And the short answer is no. And in every study that has been done, you can see that neurons in the brain will change with experience until the animal dies. And again, they showed this with the owls, showing that initially, when they did the experiments with the prisms on older animals, the older animals were having a hard time learning the task. But then they figured out that if they just shifted the visual field a little bit more gradually for the older animals, so in other words, used a different strategy, the older animals learned just as well and just as fast. So, it's a matter of also, knowing and understanding, not only do we learn differently when we're older and younger, but each one of us, and that's one of the things that, again, you asked, what astounds me. So what we are able to do is we can measure sound processing in the brain with this electricity, and then we can play it back. So I can hear how your brain responds to, say, a particular sound, like a Beatles song. And what is fascinating to me was to be able to hear how three healthy brains hear the world differently. We all hear the world differently. And this is because throughout our lives, our sound mind is just so active and alive and dynamic and changes with experience. Do I have time to talk about birds, or?
We'll end up with the syrinx and the larynx last, but I want to make sure that I get one question in here before. Heather mentions when we're talking about picking out words in a crowd, this is most obvious to me when any child says mom in the grocery store.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone understands that one.
I love that. It's so true. Even today, my kids are, between 30 and 40 years old. And if I'm in a grocery store and I hear a kid crying, first thing, not my kid.
No. And someone named Sam asks, I have attention deficit disorder. I'm often getting a lot of information from the visual. Is this an adaptation or something different? In other words, switching with attention deficit disorder. Do you think that's not your area of study? So, but does it switch more to the visual cues?
No, I really think that again, just like the right left brain oversimplification,
right.
is an oversimplification, and this visual auditory learning is also an oversimplification because it's just way more that just doesn't work that way. And I encourage Sam to read a book called Rethinking Thought by Laura Otis, who kind of started with that premise of are there auditory and visual learners, and she asked 30 very different and talented people how they thought. And it's really quite revealing and fascinating. First of all, how people think very, very differently with combinations of hearing and seeing, and how so many things that you wouldn't think, like a visual artist actually is much more responsive to sonic cues, and it's and to me, I read it as a it really showed in individual people how interactive our senses and interconnected our senses are, much more than this dichotomy that we are always searching for.
Right. In a lot of fields, we've come closer and closer to that viewpoint. I mean, that there's a spectrum of abilities and perceptions, and there's great similarities into how we all do this. But because it's all nuanced down to such fine details, that we all have a different landscape of, which is why we all have different personality of sort of what percentage of each thing is influencing what's going on. And that shifts over time too. But our emotional landscape is very similar. We all have the same emotions basically, but some spend a lot more time in anger than other ones do, and others spend a lot more time in love than other, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it was all individual.
It was also so important. And, you asked me about, what surprised me and what is important to me in science is to be able to not only get an idea of what certain groups of people do, people you might call musicians or bilinguals. So yeah, you can make certain generalizations, but what you really want to know is how Tony and George and Nina, you want to know how do individual people process these sounds and, view that in the context of what we know about general principles.
As you say, science is sort of getting started. We're only a couple hundred years into really putting that much attention on it. And the same thing is true in medicine. We might know 2 or 3%. And obviously the goal is exactly the same. How do you get as many general principles as possible and then apply them to each individual individually in the most effective way possible? And that obviously is going to require a great deal of computer memory to help us.
No, it's not going to be done ever by a computer. We are not. the brain computer analogy is not one that I.
That's why I said that. You don't like that one. So, you don't like that one. So now tell us why the brain and the computer are not the same. Why it's a bad analogy.
Well, we are not a collection of, and as people, we're not a collection of interchangeable parts. And the computers work by entirely different strategies. If you just think about a chess game, the computer will play chess by going through billions of combinations. Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this? That's how we have to now spend our lives on hold, or not on hold, but on these menus. Press 2 if it's this, press 3. It's because there's a computer that can't understand something that would take you 2 sentences to explain.
Right.
But you have to go through these things because that's how computers work. Whereas a person playing chess is an experienced chess player is going to be looking at the board and then trying to arbitrate between a handful of moves. It's entirely different.
I always love it when scientists come to that conclusion, because to me, when people talk about it, they talk about like our Zoom conferences and Zoom lectures instead of in person. It's like live theater. People thought live theater would disappear when the movies came along or television came along, and certainly it had an impact on how much live theater there was. But there is nothing that replaces live theater because there are people there, individual people, personalities, taking art through their personalities and expressing it to other people. And the same thing will be true about lectures, but this digital version isn't so bad. It's not. It's not a bad substitute, but it's always going to be a weak substitute. And there's going to be I find that entertaining because there's a sort of Silicon Valley sideline where people are hoping to be able to upload their personalities into computers and all become one with this big computer singularity. And I have no idea why that sounds popular or attractive. But in any case, one last thing, because I really want everyone to hear this, and that's about the difference between the larynx and the syrinx. You said that there are several animals who are vocal learners. Humans are not the only ones. There are songbirds, some songbirds that do it, sea lions and elephants. You mentioned those. But the birds, have a different ability to create sound than we do. So why don't you tell about that?
Yeah. Well, as humans, we have one vocal folds at one larynx that contains our vocal folds, where the air is coming from our lungs and then vibrating the vocal folds to produce the sound. And in birds, they have what's called a syrinx, and they have 2 sets of larynxes, if you will, and it's called the syrinx, and it operates very much like a larynx. But what is really very cool about it is that like the bird can sing a duet with itself, and we can't.
And it's located right where the trachea come together rather than up further along the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's fascinating. You said another thing. A lot of people think that the birds do everything by instinct, but they have to learn their songs. And you said that even the baby birds, the songbirds, do the equivalent of babbling.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many interesting things about birds. So there's a whole chapter on
Right.
bird songs. First of all, it's mostly the male birds that sing, and it's the female birds that choose. So that's interesting there, and the birds learn their song. So a male baby bird learns the song from his daddy, and if he is subjected to an impoverished song, he will learn an impoverished song, and that will not help him. And similarly, as with humans and languages, the daddy bird will speak the language and the dialect of that particular kind of bird, which then is going to be imparted to the next generation. And the sounds of these calls then enable the birds of different species, for example, to recognize each other. And it's kind of interesting again how birds who speak different dialects of the same language, the female bird is not going to be as ready to mate with a bird that speaks a dialect that she's not familiar with, even if it's from the same species. So I think that it tells us something about how our experience really shapes our preferences and choices.
And how applicable some of their experiences are to our own experiences, and how our educational system is set up. And you have lots and lots of connections in your book. So we've been discussing Of Sound Mind by Nina Kraus. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club, and it's the 119th year of Enlightened Discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again, Nina. That was a great discussion.
Thank you. Great questions.